when it's snowing and it's cold. You're gonna have to find a crew, it can't be anyone. They'll have to be there by your side and do what must be done. So go, man, you know that you have it night through day. The pain you will feel it to bring it on with the Archie County Band. Good evening, folks. You are very welcome to Bandido Talks, live here on YouTube, 7 p.m. It is the first live show of the weekend. Very much looking forward to tonight's show. Of course, we are live every Friday, every Saturday, and every Sunday, 7 p.m. here on YouTube. It is Friday night, of course. The weekend, I guess we could say, has officially started. It has started in the Bandido's mind. The weekend has started. It is, of course, Friday. Here on Friday, we have our little segment, our Let's Reflect segment. So we're going to do some reflecting tonight. It's episode 11, Fighting Fire with Fire. This should be a good one tonight. I'm looking forward to this particular show. Of course, when we do our Let's Reflect show, it is based off our Tuesday upload. What was our Tuesday upload this week? It was, of course, another Best Bits. Another Best Bits upload. And tonight's show is going to be reflecting upon one story in particular. We had 5 stories, 5 highlights, 5 clips that featured in our Best Bits upload on Tuesday. Now, don't go and watch the Best Bits upload. Remember, we're on live. You can watch it afterwards. You only get live once. You always hear me say that. So we are going to be here live right now, going down through one particular story from our Best Bits upload. I'm going to do a little recap of that particular story, so you don't need to leave the live stream. You can stay with us here. We'll be on air for the next hour or so, doing a bit of reflection on our Tuesday upload. Before I get into tonight's show, I want to, of course, say that if you enjoy our little Friday night segment, Let's Reflect, if you enjoy it, feel free to like the live stream. If you are watching the live stream after the event, get down into the comments section. Let me know what you thought about the show. If you are joining us live, please feel free to get into the live chat. I will, of course, go into the live chat. Once we get through the main bulk of tonight's episode, I will scoot over to the live chat and see if there are any little comments or queries that need to be addressed. We'll go down through that towards the end of tonight's show. And of course, if you think that what we do here at Bandido Talks is interesting, valuable, or useful in some way, feel free to follow the channel. There will, of course, be plenty of content coming your direction every week. We have our 3 live streams, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, 7 p.m. Irish time, here on YouTube. And of course, we'll always have an upload every Tuesday. It could be a Best Bits compilation. That was our upload this Tuesday. Or it could be a guest. I am working on some guest episodes. They will be coming in the incoming weeks. But we had a Best Bits upload this Tuesday. But as I said, sometimes we will have a guest on our Tuesday slot. But it's not Tuesday tonight. It is Friday. So let's get into our show tonight. Let's reflect. Episode 11, Fighting Fire with Fire. Now, I've already said, I think this is going to be an interesting show. And it's going to be based off our Tuesday upload. But specifically one story. One story in our Tuesday upload. And that story, I'm going to go over it here briefly, so that anybody who has not seen the Best Bits upload from Tuesday past will have some sort of a foundation with regards to tonight's episode. So I'm going to go down through it very quickly. We're not going to go down through it in excruciating detail, just enough so that we have enough backdrop so that tonight's episode will in fact make sense. So, Tuesday's upload, we had 5 different stories, but there's one story from our Tuesday Best Bits upload which really concerns us tonight. And that story was about the Lionesses being at war. What do I mean, the Lionesses being at war? Well, it turns out last week on our News on the Tube segment,
we dealt with a particular story with regards to Mary Earps, the former Lioness Soccer England goalkeeper. She released her autobiography, and she had some interesting details within the autobiography. And the story that we covered last week, that featured in our Best Bits upload, was essentially about Mary Earps. Mary Earps, again, former England goalkeeper with the Lionesses, women's soccer. So in her autobiography that she released recently, she had some choice words, some inflammatory words, we could say, for one of her competitors at the time. So this competitor goes by the name of Hannah Hampton. So the story goes as follows. Mary Earps was the first team goalkeeper. And in Mary Earps' autobiography, she details the fact that she was, of course, the first team goalkeeper, but Hannah Hampton, who was a competitor, a younger competitor to Mary Earps, when it was coming up to, I think it was the Euros, some big competition. Don't quote me on that. It was some big competition. I think it was the Euros. So we have Mary Earps is the first team goalkeeper, and we have this young competitor who's chomping at the bit for Mary Earps' position. This young competitor is Hannah Hampton. Now, in Mary Earps' autobiography, Mary said that Hannah Hampton was getting up to bad behaviour, and Mary Earps was pissed off about the fact that the coach at the time, whose name I cannot remember, but the coach at the time essentially allowed Hannah Hampton onto the squad, despite what Mary Earps claims as Hannah Hampton's bad behaviour. So Hannah Hampton was apparently, through Mary Earps' perspective, allowed unjustifiably onto the squad because she had been exhibiting, Hannah Hampton had been exhibiting bad behaviour. And Mary Earps was writing about this in her autobiography. And Mary Earps was not happy about the fact that this young competitor, who she deemed was getting up to bad behaviour, was allowed back onto the squad. Mary Earps was pissed off at the manager because Mary Earps felt like, well, you are rewarding bad behaviour by allowing Hannah Hampton back onto the squad. What happened, of course? Hannah Hampton takes Mary Earps' place in the squad. She takes her place in the squad. Hannah Hampton is now the first choice goalkeeper on the Lionesses. For the Lionesses when it comes up to this big tournament that I'm going to call the Euros. So Mary Earps was writing all about this in her autobiography and about how it was unfair that Hannah Hampton was allowed back into the squad because Hannah Hampton was apparently exhibiting bad behaviour that should have excluded her from the squad, but the coach at the time allowed Hannah Hampton back onto the squad despite this, quote, bad behaviour, and Hannah Hampton, the competitor to Mary Earps, took Mary Earps' first choice position as goalkeeper. So that's the general lie of the land with respect to the story. So the first thing that I thought, and you can go back and watch the episode, I think it was episode 9, News on the Tube. So last Saturday's episode, I think it was episode 9. And you can go back and listen to it after the stream tonight, and you can sort of get a feel for what it was I was thinking last week. Now, on our News on the Tube segment, as our more customary viewers will know, the News on the Tube stories that come up, I don't know what the stories are. So I just go on to my Google Chrome browser and I get a whole bunch of stories, media articles thrown my direction. And what do? I try to analyse those media articles on the spot and see what lessons we can extract from the media article. So I got this media article about Mary Earps and her autobiography and about how she was all bent out of shape about the fact that Hannah Hampton was allowed back onto the squad despite her bad behaviour and took her place for this big competition. So, if you go back and look at episode 9 and you go down into the timestamps and you see that particular story that I was analysing at the time, you will see that I was very suspicious about a certain thing when I was reading this news article and analysing it after I had read it. And the thing that I was suspicious about, now remember, I don't know anything about Mary Earps. I have not read her autobiography, and I don't know anything really about the Lionesses. I don't know anything about the dynamics between the players up through the years. I don't know anything about the coaches. I don't know. I'm just here to analyse the articles. I don't have all of the background details. So, after last Saturday's show, episode 9, where we were dealing with this story, I decided to fact check myself, just to see if I was talking out of my arse. Now, the thing that I said last week on the episode was, and perhaps you're thinking something similar, the first thing that came to my mind when I was analysing this article, or one of the first things, was bad behaviour. What does that mean? What does that mean? Bad behaviour. Define bad behaviour. Now, on the show last week, episode 9, News on the Tube, when I was analysing this article, I obviously haven't read Mary Earps' autobiography, and I don't know about all of these dynamics between the Lionesses. I don't know about any of this stuff. So I was speculating on the spot about what bad behaviour actually means. And then I did say in that episode, well, maybe it explains further in the autobiography what the bad behaviour actually was. And maybe that's what you're thinking right now when you hear me outline this story about Mary Earps and Hannah Hampton. You may be thinking, okay, so the big reveal here from the autobiography is the bad behaviour claim. So naturally, you, perhaps just like me, were probably thinking, well, what was the bad behaviour? And you probably assumed, like me, that it was explained in the autobiography. Now, it turns out that throughout this week, I have been getting a whole bunch of stories come up on my Google Chrome browser about what? Mary Earps and her autobiography. So I've been getting peppered by all of these different stories. So I decided, as I said, to maybe fact check my reasoning from last week's show. So I went down into some of these articles and I found out something interesting. Something interesting. What is this interesting thing that I found out? Well, it turns out that in Mary Earps' autobiography, she does not explain what the bad behaviour was that she is claiming Hannah Hampton was exhibiting. Interesting indeed. So what I actually then found out was Mary Earps, in her autobiography, simply wrote, Hannah Hampton, my competitor, who took my place for this big competition. Hannah Hampton was getting up to bad behaviour, but Mary Earps did not tell us what that bad behaviour was. She just left it lingering on the page. Never gave any details. So the reader of Mary Earps' autobiography, or someone who happens to be analysing a particular media article about Mary Earps' autobiography for a show called Bandido Talks, does also not understand what the bad behaviour actually was. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the bad behaviour was that Mary Earps is claiming Hannah Hampton got up to. Now, I found this interesting. I found it interesting, and I thought it would actually make a really good episode tonight to go down into what I think we can learn from this, what further lessons we can extract from this particular media article or just situation in general as it's turning out to be. So here we have Mary Earps writing something that I would deem as pretty controversial in that world. Essentially, Mary Earps has accused Hannah Hampton of bad behaviour. In other words, Mary Earps has tarnished or tried to tarnish Hannah Hampton's reputation. Now, for people familiar with the show, what we do here on Bandido Talks, you will be familiar. I've talked about it multiple times. Status. Status and status loss. These are important things to consider when we're looking at human behaviour. And when you tarnish someone's reputation, or you try to tarnish someone's reputation, what are you actually doing? You're trying to reduce their status. You're trying to cut their status. You're trying to undermine their status. That is what you're trying to do. You're trying to attack their credibility. We have lots of different ways for saying this, but essentially, Mary Earps, in her autobiography, she has made an accusation against Hannah Hampton, claiming that Hannah Hampton got up to bad behaviour, and that this bad behaviour was so severe, apparently, that she should not have been allowed back onto the squad, because Mary Earps was claiming that by allowing Hannah Hampton back onto the squad, following this bad behaviour outburst, it was sending out the wrong message, essentially, to the rest of the squad. In other words, Mary Earps believed that the coach was rewarding bad behaviour. Now, naturally, when we would hear a story like this, I think everybody would be curious to know, well, what was the bad behaviour? Did Hannah Hampton sleep with Mary Earps's boyfriend or husband? Actually, I think Mary Earps is a lesbian. So maybe did she sleep with Mary Earps's woman or girlfriend or wife? Did Hannah Hampton sleep with somebody else's boyfriend, woman or wife or husband? What was the bad behaviour? Did she throw an egg at Mary Earps? Did she tip Mary Earps's clothing out of the hotel window? Did she bust up a hotel room? What was the bad behaviour? Please explain, Mary. But Mary never explains. She leaves the accusation hanging, very vague. And if you watch last week's show, episode 9, News on the Tube, this particular article, when I was analysing it at the time, I said something along the lines of, bad behaviour sounds pretty subjective to me. Now, it turns out, when I've done a little bit more digging into this story, because of, not digging because I went out of my way to do it, but because multiple stories started to come up on my Google Chrome browser, because this actually turned out to be a fairly controversial book in the world of women's soccer, and particularly among the Lionesses and the supporters of the Lionesses. It turned out to be fairly controversial for this reason, I think. We've essentially got an accusation about bad behaviour, but we don't give any details about what the bad behaviour was. So naturally, Hannah Hampton, on the other side of this, has now got a little bit of a decision to make. She's had an accusation thrown her direction. And this accusation is very vague. It is damaging because people are going to start making inferences about what the bad behaviour was. People are going to use their imaginations. I've gave some rough possibilities. Maybe she slept with one of their boyfriends or women, or trashed a hotel room, or threw an egg at someone, whatever the heck it is. But the point is, Hannah Hampton has had an accusation thrown her direction. A vague accusation with not a lot of detail. So, in other words, to go back to what I've already said, Hannah Hampton has had some reputational damage. To some degree, she's had some reputational damage in the last week or two since this autobiography was released. Because people are going to start to wonder, well, is Hannah Hampton a bad egg? Is Hannah Hampton a troublemaker? Maybe the club she's currently at, I don't know what club she's at, but let's say the other teammates in her club team start to speculate and think, well, maybe Hannah is, maybe this accusation, bad behaviour, what does this mean? She's getting up to bad behaviour, coming up to such an important competition, and she's causing disruption within the Lionesses, and, can we trust Hannah Hampton? I mean, what if this bad behaviour is a really bad thing? The point here is, people will start to talk. what was the bad behaviour? In other words, Hannah Hampton has had an attack on her credibility from Mary Earps. What does that mean when somebody attacks your credibility? What does it mean when somebody attacks your reputation? Well, what it means is they are coming after your status, your standing within your community or group of people. They're coming after your status and they're trying to undermine your status. What does that mean? Reduce your standing among your peers. They're trying to tarnish your reputation in some way for some reason. So why am I saying all this? And how is this actually related to our show tonight? Fighting fire with fire. Well, it's actually very related. I would argue. It's very related. How is it related? Well, as I've already said, Hannah Hampton has a decision to make. She has a decision to make because she has had an accusation thrown at her which is threatening essentially to undermine her credibility, reputation and status among her peers. This could have ramifications for her career, depending, of course, on what the bad behaviour was. Now, it wasn't specified, but as I've said, people will use their imagination. People will make inferences about what this means. The point is, her reputation, credibility and status, all meaning the same thing. Reputation, credibility, status. I like the word status because it pisses people off. When you say, oh, you care about your status, people go, oh no, I don't care about my status. Oh no, I don't care what other people think of me. No, I don't care about that. I don't care about my status. And they really try to convince you about how they don't care about their status. It's normally those ones, the ones who try to convince you vehemently that they don't care about their status. They are the ones who care the most about their status, I would argue. So, what's the point here? What is the point? Hannah Hampton has the decision to make. Her credibility has been attacked. She risks losing status. How's that related to our show tonight? Fighting fire with fire. Well, let's get into this. Let's get into this common saying. Because we hear this all the time. Oh, you need to fight fire with fire. What does that mean? Fight fire with fire. Well, here's what I think it means. Fighting fire with fire, the way I understand this particular saying, is essentially taking your opponent's strategy or tactics and using it against them in order to win. That is how I define fighting fire with fire. So you take your opponent's strategy or tactics and you then use it against them in order to win. That is fighting fire with fire from the Bandido's perspective. That's what I think. So, Hannah Hampton has a decision to make. And one of the plays here on the chessboard is to fight fire with fire. Now, what would that look like for Hannah Hampton? Well, let's again have a look at what Mary Earps has actually done here. Mary Earps has released an autobiography and she has accused Hannah Hampton of bad behaviour. It's a vague statement. It has not been elaborated on in the book. We don't know what the bad behaviour was. But needless to say, it is placing Hannah Hampton in a negative light. That whether it's Mary Earps' intention or not, we can speculate on that. That's a separate topic. The point is, it is putting Hannah Hampton in a negative light. And it's putting her reputation in a negative light. And it's likely, one could argue, going to lead to some degree of status loss for Hannah Hampton. Because it's a negative statement about her. It's putting in question her professional nature. She's a professional athlete. You're supposed to be professional. So it's putting Hannah Hampton's professionalism on the line. In a sense, it's making people question how professional an athlete is Hannah Hampton. If you've got Mary Earps, this, I suppose we could say, from what I can tell, Mary Earps seems to be a respected member of the Lionesses squad, a long-time member. So you've got this, quote, respectable person, this person who people would respect in the lioness sphere, in that particular world of women's soccer. You've got this respected person claiming that someone isn't very professional, attacking their professionalism, their reputation, through an accusation in her autobiography. So this is the thing. Hannah Hampton has a decision to make. Does she fight fire with fire? So in this context, what does fighting fire with fire look like for Hannah Hampton? Well, we've just explained what fighting fire with fire means from the Bandido's perspective. It means taking your opponent's strategy or tactics and using it against them in order to win. So in this case, if Hannah Hampton was to fight fire with fire against Mary Earps, it would involve something like the following. It would involve Hannah Hampton accusing Mary Earps of something in order to undermine her status and her credibility or her reputation, whatever word we want to use. So that would be the play. If Hannah Hampton wanted to choose the, quote, fighting fire with fire strategy, well, what she would do right now is she would load up the cannon with an accusation and blow it in the direction of Mary Earps. That's what she would do. She would find some sort of accusation, something to criticize Mary Earps on, something that would cause people to second guess Mary Earps' professionalism as a professional women's soccer player. She would load that up into the status cannon, ignite the little thing that stands up from the cannon, whatever you call it, and then let it explode in the direction towards Mary Earps. That would be fighting fire with fire if you were Hannah Hampton. Essentially, accuse Mary Earps of something that, with the intention, accuse Mary Earps of something with the intention of undermining her status, reputation, or credibility. That would be fighting fire with fire. Now, let's talk a little bit about this, fighting fire with fire. Let's talk about, is fighting fire with fire, in this particular circumstance, or any circumstance, let's evaluate if it is actually, well, let's have a look at it as a strategy, first of all. And then we'll sort of try to figure out if it would be actually a good play on the chessboard here for Hannah Hampton. So let's think about this strategy, fighting fire with fire. We've heard it many times. And in fact, we maybe have even heard of it in the sporting context, fight fire with fire. So it's very applicable here. But let's think of this literally. I want you to think of fighting fire with fire literally. What would be a good example here? Okay, well, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. It's a Quentin Tarantino movie called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think it was released in 2019. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood by Quentin Tarantino. I really enjoyed the movie. It had Leonardo DiCaprio playing a guy called Rick Dalton, and it had Brad Pitt playing a guy called Cliff, I think, a stunt double. He was Rick Dalton's stunt double, I think, Cliff. I think that's what his name was. So anyway, Leonardo DiCaprio's character in this movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, is called Rick Dalton. Now, I don't want to spoil the movie, so I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty details of what the movie's actually about. I would recommend you watch it. I thought it was an entertaining movie. I enjoyed it. I've watched it a couple of times. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I do remember I laughed and I thought it was entertaining. Good movie. So, Rick Dalton, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. At the end of the movie, without getting into the nitty-gritty details of why this happens, but essentially, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, ends up with a flamethrower in his hands. So he has a flamethrower in his hands, and needless to say, he uses the flamethrower for a particular reason. And it's amusing when you see it on screen. I thought it was amusing. But the point is, when you see Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Rick Dalton, use this flamethrower, and if you've maybe seen a flamethrower used in real life, it produces a lot of flame. It produces a lot of fire, in other words. I think that would be fair to say. That is the objective of the weapon. It is a flamethrower. It is supposed to project flames or fire. Fair enough. So I want you to imagine you have a flamethrower. Okay? You have a flamethrower just like Rick Dalton has a flamethrower. Now I want you to imagine you have an opponent a few feet away. And he also has a flamethrower. The exact same brand that you have. Now I want you to imagine that you fire your flamethrower at the same time that your opponent fires their flamethrower. You're going to get two streams of flame, two streams of fire colliding. Now, what will happen when both of these streams of fire collide? It's going to create a larger fire. And what happens when you create a larger fire in an uncontrolled fashion? When you shoot a flamethrower, so you have a flamethrower and you shoot it, and your opponent, who you're competing against, shoots their flame out of their flamethrower as well. You're shooting to win. However, when the flames collide, they create a bigger, more uncontrollable, more violent flame in the center. And because this flame, because these two streams of fire meet each other at full velocity, they create this uncontrolled, violent flame. When this happens, notice the key word. It's uncontrolled. In other words, when the flames collide from the flamethrowers that have been shot, the result is an uncontrolled flame that's going to lead to what? Uncertainty. Violence. So when we think about fighting fire with fire, I would encourage people to think of it literally. What happens when you literally fight fire with fire? If you have a flamethrower and your opponent has a flamethrower, you shoot flames at the same time. The flames meet in the middle. They create this roaring, uncontrollable blaze. It's violent. And as a result of being uncontrolled and being violent, the outcome of how the flame, the big fire that's being created, the outcome of how it's going to behave is uncertain. What do I mean by it's uncertain? Well, when these flames meet, for all we know, the behaviour of the big uncontrollable violent flame could be so uncontrollable, so violent, that sparks fly and something else catches on fire. Perhaps your own clothing catches on fire. Perhaps the building in which this standoff is taking place between you and your opponent, something catches fire. Perhaps there was a little bit of oil somewhere that you initially thought was out of reach, or that you perhaps didn't even know was there. And because you and your opponent use these flamethrowers to fight against each other, the streams of flame collide in the middle, create this blazing, uncontrollable, violent flame that has an uncertainty to its behaviour. Things can go wrong. Unpredictable things can arise from this roaring, uncontrollable flame that's created from these two streams of fire from two different flamethrowers. So when we think of this literally, when we fight fire with fire, physically in the real world, I would argue that when two streams of flame collide in the center, you are going to have a larger flame created, a larger fire created. And we always have this saying, don't we? Don't play with fire. Or you might hear somebody say, oh, such and such is playing with fire. We have a saying for it. In other words, the saying, oh, such and such is playing with fire. He'd want to be careful. He's playing with fire. What are we really getting at with a statement like that? Well, what we're getting at is fire is dangerous. Fire is inherently dangerous. It can be very useful, but it can be dangerous if it's not controlled. What happens when you have two flamethrowers that shoot fire at one another and the streams of fire meet in the middle? Do you have a controlled fire that is created? No, I would argue you do not. The resulting fire that's created from you and your opponent firing through your flamethrowers, I would argue that when you fire, when they meet in the middle, the resulting flame or fire is actually out of your control and it's out of your opponent's control. In other words, you're going to create this violent, uncontrollable monster that's going to be unpredictable in its behaviour, and therefore the outcome for both you and your opponent will be, to a certain degree, uncertain. There will be uncertainty because, as I've said, perhaps the flame is so violent, the resulting fire from these two streams of flame coming from the flamethrowers is so uncertain, it's so unpredictable. Perhaps your clothing catches fire, perhaps the building catches fire, perhaps there's an oil source, as I've said, a petrol source that you didn't realise was there, and the blaze is so wild because these two streams of fire have met that it catches fire. So why am I bringing this into a very physical realm here? Well, I'm trying to illustrate that when you apply the strategy of, quote, fighting fire with fire, I would argue that you must realise fighting fire with fire is unpredictable, uncertain, and violent. It is those three things: uncertain, unpredictable, violent. You will not be able to control the resulting flame, the resulting fire. So, let's bring this back to Mary Earps and Hannah Hampton. Mary Earps has launched fire towards Hannah Hampton. Mary Earps has taken out her flamethrower. She's taken out the flamethrower through her autobiography. And she has pressed the fire flame button and she shot it in the direction of Hannah Hampton. And that flame that Mary Earps has shot in the direction of Hannah Hampton is, quote, burning Hannah Hampton's reputation, credibility, status. So Mary Earps, through words on a page and through an accusation of bad behaviour, which is bringing Hannah Hampton's professionalism into question. This flame that Mary Earps has shot at Hannah Hampton is literally, I would argue, from a status, reputational standpoint, it's burning her credibility. So Hannah Hampton, she's been stung, she's been burned by Mary Earps and her accusation of bad behaviour. So, as I've already said, Hannah Hampton could fight fire with fire. So that would involve Hannah Hampton going and getting her flamethrower, loading it up, pressing the fire flame button and shooting flames back at Mary Earps and burning her reputation, her credibility, her status. That's what fighting fire with fire would look like. Now, to use our example that we've just talked about bringing fighting fire with fire into the physical world, if Hannah Hampton shoots flames back at Mary Earps, then what you're going to get is fire on fire. Because if Hannah Hampton were to do that, she is essentially taking Mary Earps's strategy or tactics and using it against Mary Earps in order to try and win. In this case, win the battle of status. It's a status battle. Who is going to maintain or hold on to more of their status, essentially? So in other words, who can burn more of the other's status? And who can be left standing with the most unburnt status? Now, as I've just said from our example, if Hannah Hampton were to fight fire with fire in this case, well, I would argue you've now got an unpredictable, uncertain, and violent war that's going on. Why would I say that? Well, if Hannah Hampton launches flames back at Mary Earps, in other words, if Hannah Hampton tries to damage Mary Earps' reputation in some way, in a similar fashion to how Mary Earps has tried to damage Hannah Hampton's reputation, well, now we are in a fire-on-fire battle. And what does this descend into? Well, it actually descends into accusation after accusation after accusation after accusation. Now, remember, this is all potentially, if Hannah Hampton were to fight fire with fire, this is all going to take place in the public domain. It's all going to take place publicly. So people are going to act as an audience. The onlookers will act as the judges. And this is the unpredictable part. The audience are the judges. The people who are going to be watching this battle between potentially Mary Earps and Hannah Hampton. The people will ultimately judge. The people, the onlookers, the audience, they will be the ultimate judges of who loses the most status and who leaves this conflict with most of their reputation or more of their reputation intact. The people will decide. And this is the thing, folks. In this case, if Hannah Hampton decides to fight fire with fire against Mary Earps, the uncertainty, the, how can we say, unpredictability is going to come from the audience. Because Hannah Hampton is going to have to weigh up, well, what kind of accusation could I throw back at Mary Earps that doesn't cross the line? Because if it crosses the line, this is going to backfire on me. I've already lost status because of Mary Earps' accusation. If I don't launch a sort of calculated, well thought out accusation in the direction of Mary Earps, I could actually end up losing more status, more credibility. Because if I cross the line with my accusation, this is Hannah Hampton, I'm speaking from her perspective. If Hannah Hampton were to launch her counter accusation, but let's say she crosses the line. Let's say she cuts Mary Earps a little too deeply for the onlooking audience's liking. What happens? Hannah Hampton loses even more credibility. And in fact, the onlooking judges, the onlooking audience may actually infer that Mary Earps was right in the first place. Look at this bad behaviour. Look at the disgusting nature of this accusation that Hannah Hampton has thrown back at Mary Earps. That was below the belt, Hannah. So if Hannah is going to fight fire with fire, she needs to be, I would argue, careful about her counter-accusation. Because if it's not done in a calculated, well thought out fashion, she ends up coming off worse. And this is the danger of fighting fire with fire. Because if Hannah Hampton is going to engage and use a similar strategy, use similar tactics that Mary Earps has used to tarnish Hannah Hampton's credibility, Hannah Hampton has to be careful. She has to thread the line of some sort of an accusation that is damaging. It has to be damaging to Mary Earps. So it has to do some damage to the credibility. Otherwise, it's a weak counter. And Mary Earps wins in the status battle. At the same time, Hannah Hampton, if she goes too over the top and criticises or accuses Mary Earps of something that the public would define as below the belt, would define as going too far. Well, now Hannah Hampton not only incurs the status, reputational damage from Mary Earps' accusation, but she literally gets burned by her own accusation. Because she decided to engage in a fighting fire with fire strategy. She ends up getting burned by her own accusation because she didn't thread the line accurately enough. So this is fighting fire with fire. And this is, I suppose, the key point here, folks. Fighting fire with fire, I would argue, it's not that it's a invalid strategy. It's a very valid strategy. It's definitely a play on the table. But if you are going to use the strategy of fighting fire with fire, you ought to realize that when fire meets fire, it produces a bigger, more uncontrollable, more unpredictable flame at the center. And that bigger, more violent, more unpredictable flame or fire that has been created by the fire from your opponent and your fire that you've shot, that bigger, more violent flame could end up burning you. Now, you don't want that to happen, obviously. You're using the fighting fire with fire strategy. You're using it because you want to try and win. You want to try and defeat your opponent. In this case, Hannah Hampton would be using it to try and win the war on status. Hannah Hampton wants to cut Mary Earps' status more than Mary Earps was able to cut her status, so that Hannah Hampton wins. She comes out with more credibility. Her status higher than Mary Earps'. But remember, if you're going to engage fire with fire, you must realize it's not that it's an invalid strategy. It's more to do with the fact that understanding the mechanics of using that strategy. When two flames meet, they're going to make a bigger flame. And you have to understand that that flame, we know this. We all know that fire is very difficult to control. Fire is very destructive. We know this. We have many sayings that use fire in a way that suggests that it's dangerous. You need care. You need to have caution around fire. We know this as humans. So if you're going to use fire on fire as a strategy for war, then you need to realize that there's a certain unpredictability, uncertainty, and violence that can come when fire meets fire. Now, is this actually Hannah Hampton's only option here? Is the only option that Hannah Hampton has is to fight? Is the only option to fight fire with fire? Is that the only option available to Hannah Hampton? No, it is not. One of the most effective strategies, I would argue, in a circumstance like this. So we have Mary Earps has attacked Hannah Hampton's credibility. Mary Earps has taken out her flamethrower and shot fire at Hannah Hampton with the intent of burning Hannah Hampton's reputation and burning Hannah Hampton's status. Now, what Hannah Hampton could do is, instead of fighting fire with fire, what Hannah Hampton could do is understand Mary Earps' strategy. So understand that Mary Earps has taken out a flamethrower and shot flames at Hannah Hampton's reputation. If Hannah Hampton understands the strategy, then Hannah Hampton, one could argue, could choose a different means of counteracting the flames that are coming her direction. What is an effective way to put out a fire? What's an effective way to put out a fire? Well, one could say water is perhaps an interesting counter to fire. Water's an interesting counter. When we see the fire brigade, let's say there's a fire at a house or a building, the fire brigade will come with water. They'll come with their big hoses and they'll shoot out water. Why? Because they're trying to subdue the flames, eliminate the fire, make it more manageable, reduce its unpredictability, make it less violent. So in this example, Hannah Hampton could go back into her closet and choose a flamethrower as a weapon to counter Mary Earps's stinging, burning, reputational attack. In other words, Hannah Hampton could fight fire with fire, but we've already discussed some of the perils that can come with fighting fire on fire. But let's say Hannah Hampton fully understands Mary Earps's attack. Say she understands the strategy that Mary Earps has used. So Mary Earps has used a flamethrower and shot flames at Hannah Hampton's reputation. Hannah Hampton could go back into the closet and instead of picking up a flamethrower, she could pick up a fire hose full of water. And Hannah Hampton could counter Mary Earps's flames from her flamethrower with water from her fire hose. What does this look like in real life? Well, in a circumstance like this, Mary Earps has made an accusation against Hannah Hampton. But Mary Earps has made a mistake in her accusation, I would argue. And the mistake was she didn't provide any of the details of the bad behaviour. So it's a very vague claim. The intent is there to damage Hannah Hampton's reputation, but it's vague. Now, if Hannah Hampton, I would argue, if Hannah Hampton was playing this smart, if Hannah Hampton wanted to play this in a way that is more controlled, there's less unpredictability, there's less potential for a violent exchange here. If Hannah Hampton wanted to play this cleverly, I would argue that what Hannah Hampton could do is one of the all-time great strategies for a hater, or an all-time great strategy for someone who is throwing accusations, vague accusations around. And this strategy is ignorance. I'm saying ignorance. Let's get into this actually. It really is to ignore the other person. Now that may be hard to do. I can understand, and we've all felt this. How do we ignore someone who has so obviously, in the public sphere, attacked our credibility? It's tough to do. It is tough to do, because when we feel like someone is attacking our reputation, attacking our credibility, attacking our status, essentially trying to undermine our standing within the wider world, it is tough to take a step back and ignore the accusation. Plead ignorance. This is difficult to do. But I would argue that if Hannah Hampton were to simply ignore Mary Earps's accusation in her autobiography, I would argue if Hannah Hampton simply, nonchalantly ignores the accusation, doesn't throw fire back at Mary Earps, just ignores the accusation, I would argue that is the equivalent of Hannah Hampton going back into her closet and picking out the fire hose and shooting it right back at Mary Earps, extinguishing Mary Earps's fire and soaking Mary Earps. If Hannah Hampton could just ignore, if Hannah Hampton could just not bite on the accusation. Why do I say this? Well, I'll tell you why I'm saying this. is because anybody who has been paying attention to this particular story, if Hannah Hampton has been paying attention to the general public perception of this statement in Mary Earps' autobiography, Hannah Hampton will realise something interesting. The judging public is not impressed with Mary Earps and her accusation that's very vague. And if Hannah Hampton can just nonchalantly ignore what has been thrown her direction, with each passing day, Mary Earps looks like a bigger arse. Mary Earps looks like a bigger arsehole with the passing of every hour and every day. Because if Hannah Hampton understands what Mary Earps has done, so if Hannah Hampton understands the underlying mechanics and realises, okay, Mary Earps has made a vague accusation against me. Is this initially damaging to my reputation as a professional athlete? Yeah. Okay, initially, I'm going to incur some status loss from people in certain quarters of the public. I will incur some status loss. However, Hannah Hampton realises what Mary Earps has done, has shot fire through a flamethrower to burn her reputation. But if Hannah Hampton's paying attention to this strategy and understands the mechanics of fighting fire with fire, and is paying attention to the judging public, with each passing day, Mary Earps' accusation, with each passing day that Hannah Hampton doesn't bite back, doesn't throw fire back at Mary Earps, with each passing day, Mary Earps looks increasingly more unreasonable. And guess what? It could then start to backfire on Mary Earps. Because if Hannah Hampton can just nonchalantly, calmly, coolly, with composure, get on with her career, get on with the rest of her week, go back to her club, put in some good performances with the club, be on good behaviour, be a reasonable human, don't get into a war of status with someone who's now retired. In other words, if Hannah Hampton can ignore Mary Earps, just continue to ignore Mary Earps, be utterly ignorant when she's asked about it. Hannah, could we get a comment on what Mary Earps said about you in her autobiography about your bad behaviour? Mary Earps said something about me in her autobiography. I got mentioned in her autobiography. Yeah, you got mentioned for bad behaviour and Mary Earps was really unhappy. All right, well, that's news to me. Yeah, I really like Mary. No, Mary's a terrific goalkeeper and yeah, I wish nothing but the best for Mary. Yeah, I'm glad I got a mention in her book. Oh, that would sink Mary Earps. Sink her. Absolutely sink her. That is like taking out the fire hose and soaking, just blowing Mary Earps away. Totally putting out her flame, soaking her, done. If Hannah Hampton can just ignore the accusation and let another day pass, and another day pass, and another day pass, and resist fighting fire with fire, I would argue Mary Earps is cooked. In this particular back and forth, she is cooked. If Hannah Hampton can just play this with composure, nonchalant, if she's asked about it, don't throw an accusation back. Don't try to tarnish Mary Earps' reputation. Don't fight fire with fire in this instance. Because if Hannah Hampton fights fire with fire, we've already talked about this. We've now got an unpredictable, uncertain, more violent situation on our hands. Because, as I've already said, Hannah Hampton would have to thread the line on this accusation. If she doesn't have enough punch in the accusation, then Mary Earps' accusation looks worse than hers. And so Mary Earps wins. Mary Earps has cut Hannah Hampton's status more than Hannah Hampton was able to cut Mary Earps' status. In other words, her accusation, her counter-accusation was too weak. Likewise, on the flip side, if Hannah Hampton crosses the line with her accusation or her attempt on Mary Earps' reputation and status, if she crosses the line, if she says something that's too inflammatory for the liking of the judging audience or the judging public, if it's below the belt, if it's going too far, then that backfires on Hannah Hampton, and she gets burned by her own accusation, by her own attempt to fling fire at Mary Earps. So Hannah Hampton could use the fighting fire with fire strategy here, and she could maybe win using it. But I would argue, in a circumstance like this, the unpredictability and uncertainty that would come from Hannah Hampton fighting fire on fire with Mary Earps, that unpredictability is not worth it, given that I think Hannah Hampton has a better option in her closet. She has the flamethrower in the closet if she wants to use it. But I think Hannah Hampton would be better analysing her opponent's strategy, understanding that Mary Earps has attempted to tarnish her reputation and cut her status, undermine her status. Essentially, Mary Earps has taken out the flamethrower and shot flames and tried to burn Hannah Hampton's reputation. If Hannah Hampton can understand that, understand then the mechanics of fighting fire on fire from her end, understand that she could win using that strategy, but she could also get burned by using that strategy. And then finally, using her knowledge of Mary Earps' strategy and using her knowledge of just generally fighting fire with fire, Hannah Hampton could then realise, actually, there's a better way to approach this. And in this circumstance, I would argue the better way for Hannah Hampton to approach this would be to completely ignore the accusation. I understand this is difficult. And as I've already said, anytime, think of it, folks, when someone has attacked your reputation and tried to undermine your status and your credibility within the wider public, it is the reflex reaction is to fight fire with fire, I would argue. That is the reflex reaction. The reflex reaction is, where the fuck's my flamethrower? Where is it? Where's the flamethrower? Because I need to shoot it at the person who's just tried to burn my reputation. That is the reflex reaction. It could be the right strategy, but it may also not be the right strategy, because you could end up getting burned by your own flamethrower or by the wild, unpredictable flame that it creates with your opponent's fire when they meet in the middle. So in this case, if Hannah Hampton could just ignore, literally ignore, don't write about it on social media, don't make reference to it, go out, play your next game, go to training, be professional. Do the best you can when you play the matches, do the best, put in the best performance you can put in. And show your teammates, show your coach, show the wider public how professional you are. Ignore the statement. Ignore the accusation. And then, if Hannah Hampton is asked about the accusation of bad behaviour, this vague accusation, if Hannah Hampton is then asked about it, which she may well be asked, she may be asked at a press conference. Maybe the reporters will gather outside her house. Who knows? I don't know. But say some reporter, some media schmuck, comes up to Hannah Hampton and tries to poke her. Oh, Hannah, did you hear what Mary Earps has written about you in her autobiography, saying that, you shouldn't have been allowed back onto the Lionesses team because of your bad behaviour, and about how your bad behaviour was setting a bad precedent within the team. if that question gets posed to Hannah Hampton, Hannah Hampton should play it oh so cool. Yeah, well, that's interesting. I didn't realise that I had featured in Mary's book. Mary's a great goalkeeper. Great goalkeeper. Tremendous respect for Mary. I had a great competitive relationship with her whenever we were competing for the first goalkeeping spot in the Lionesses team. We had a great competition that year. I wish Mary the best. I hope her autobiography does very well, and I'm glad that, I got a mention in it. Fantastic. If Hannah Hampton can say something like that, Mary Earps is cooked in this war of status, in this war of words. Cooked! Absolutely cooked. So, to finish up tonight, folks, to summarize, I want to be clear. Fighting fire with fire is not an invalid strategy. It is a very valid strategy, and it can be used. And there are circumstances in which you would want to use it. I would argue that in this circumstance with Hannah Hampton and Mary Earps, I would argue that it's not the best strategy for all of the reasons that I've already outlined. However, that doesn't mean that it's not a valid strategy. And let me give you a quick example of where fighting fire with fire could be a valid strategy. So let's imagine you are out on the street and for some reason, some lunatic with a knife runs up towards you and looks like he has the intent of stabbing you. So naturally, you see this guy coming up with his big machete knife, running towards you. He has his eyes locked on you. And you realise, oh shit, he's coming for me with his machete. Okay. So let's imagine your first reaction is to run. Okay, I'm going to try and outrun this guy. Okay, because he looks dangerous, he looks like he means business, and I don't want to be chopped sushi, essentially. So let's say you run. And for whatever reason, in the heat of the moment, you turn left because you think left is the best turn. But you don't realise that you've turned into an alley with no exit. So there's only one entry, and you've already entered the alley, and you realise there's a big brick wall at the back of the alley, and there's no exit. There's no way to climb the wall, you're stuck. And let's imagine this lunatic with the machete turns into the same alleyway, and now you're trapped. Okay. So you can't climb the wall. You can't boulder through the wall. There's nobody around to help you. It's just you and the guy with the machete. So, let's imagine in this circumstance, the bin beside you. You look over towards the bin and you see, okay, I can actually see like a baseball bat. And you pick the baseball bat out of the bin. Now, the guy, the lunatic with the machete, his intent is to stab you and to rob you of whatever money or whatever valuables you have on your person. That's his intent. So he's going to use his machete to essentially kill you and then rob you. So that's his intent. Now, as he's walking you down, you pick up your baseball bat. Is this a moment where fighting fire with fire is a good strategy? Yes, I would argue. Because he's going to come at you with force and malicious intent. Now, you have no way to escape. Let's imagine you've no way to escape. The only way for you to come out of this situation with your life intact is to literally subdue the opponent. So if the opponent's going to come at you with physical force and you have no way to escape, then you're going to have to use physical force on the opponent. In other words, it's physical force on physical force. In other words, it's fire on fire. So that's a circumstance where fire on fire is the best strategy. This lunatic, let's imagine he's off his head on drugs. He's been smoking dope all day and he's just shot up some hardcore drugs. God only knows what. So let's say he's not even thinking straight. So you're not going to be able to reason with this individual. You can't reason with him. He's off his rocker, and he's got a machete. And he wants to inflict physical damage upon you, and not just do that, but then rob you. He wants to essentially bestow force upon your body. So in this instance, is fighting fire with fire the best strategy? I think so. You have your baseball bat. He has his machete. Is it unpredictable? Is it going to get violent? Is there uncertainty to the outcome? Absolutely. All the things we talked about earlier. When you fight fire with fire, it's unpredictable, it's uncertain, it's violent. You can't control the outcome as well as you would like to. All of the things we've talked about still apply. But the circumstances have changed. In this instance, the option of reasoning with this individual is out the window. He's off, he's out of his mind. He's out of his mind. There's no talking to him, and he's encroaching upon you rapidly with his machete. There's no guarantee that you're going to leave this situation with your life. But the thing is, what's your alternative? Well, the alternative is try to talk sense into him. Going to be difficult for the reasons we've already outlined. He's drugged up and he's out of his mind. Could you try to climb the wall? Good luck. It's going to be very difficult to do that. And he's already encroaching upon you. You don't have time. So in that case, fire on fire, fighting fire with fire, I would argue, is the best option. However, the same things that we talked about earlier still apply. When you fight fire with fire, it creates a bigger, larger, more uncontrollable, more violent flame when fire meets fire. And as a result, the behaviour of that flame is more unpredictable and it's more uncertain. But in that case, we could easily argue that the best option when you're cornered like that is fire on fire. So I'm not saying that fighting fire on fire is a bad strategy. It's only a bad strategy if it's chosen when there's a better option on the table. And in our circumstance here with Mary Earps and Hannah Hampton, I think there's a better option on the table for Hannah Hampton. And the other option that's on the table is ignore Mary Earps. Ignore her comment. And when it's brought up to you, Hannah Hampton, play it off nonchalantly. Play it off coolly. Oh so cool, with composure. Pretend you haven't even heard the comment. Praise Mary Earps. Tell everybody how great a goalkeeper she was. Tell everybody that she's a really good person, that you respect her. And then add in a wee bit of humour at the end and say, well, you know, I'm glad I was able to make it into Mary's book, one way or the other. Case closed. In that circumstance, far better strategy. But that doesn't mean that fighting fire with fire isn't a good strategy. Like everything, folks, it's going to depend on the circumstances. For Mary Earps and Hannah Hampton, I think in those circumstances, there's a better option on the table. In our other example, where we've got the lunatic nut with a machete running after you, who's drugged out of his mind, and you've ran into an alleyway with no exit, and you've got a baseball bat, and he's rapidly encroaching, fire on fire. You got to do what you got to do. But the principles still apply. When fire meets fire, it creates a bigger flame, a more uncontrollable flame, a more violent flame, which makes things more unpredictable and more uncertain. Okay, so I think that's a wrap on our main body of content for episode 11, Fighting Fire with Fire. Let's have a look at the chat. So we've been going for 1 hour and 21 minutes. An hour and 21 minutes. It flies in. It flies in here on Bandido Talks. As I've said before, when you get the ignition up and running with the old Bandido, an hour and 20 minutes is wee buns. Wee buns. Okay, let's have a look at our chat and see if we have anybody in the chat. Now, have we got anybody in the chat? Let's see. Of course, I could go to the chat and there could be nobody in it. If there's nobody in it, well then we're going to have to wait till tomorrow night and see if we get any people to tune into the show. So let's have a look here. Shoot over to the chat. And it turns out, let me see. Top chat. Live chat. Let's see if we got any messages. And it turns out that we've got no messages. The Bandido has no messages tonight in the live chat. Oh well. All I can say is, for those of you folks who are watching the live stream after it has been posted, feel free to get down into the comments section. Feel free to get down there and let me know what you thought about the show. I thought that was a good show tonight. Interesting, fighting fire with fire. Let's choose our strategies wisely. Wisely. Be wise about choosing our strategies. Understand the potential pros and cons of each strategy. Always understand what your opponent's strategy is. Just because you understand your opponent's strategy doesn't mean you have to use it back on the opponent. It may be a good decision. There may be another better option on the table. Circumstances will dictate. But I think that's a wrap for tonight, folks. I think we will call it quits. Good show. As I've said in our little introduction, if you like tonight's show, give it a like. Hit that little thumbs up button. If you are arriving to the recording of the live stream after it has been posted, after the live event, as I've said, get down into the comments section, let me know what you thought about the show. And of course, if you enjoy what we're doing here at Bandido Talks, then feel free to subscribe to the channel and get notified of all of the content that's going to be coming your direction this week and in the incoming weeks. So that's a wrap for tonight, folks. We will be back tomorrow evening, 7 p.m. Irish time here on YouTube. Remember, every Friday, Saturday and Sunday we are live here on YouTube, 7 p.m. Irish time. We will be back tomorrow night for News on the Tube. News on the Tube back tomorrow night. So that'll be 7 p.m. here on YouTube. Until then, folks, I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. And all being well, I will get chatting with you all tomorrow night, 7 p.m. here on YouTube for some News on the Tube. Enjoy your evening, folks. I get chatting to you all tomorrow evening.